I put out a video back in 2019 titled Everything is Political, and to be honest, going back to watch it now, it's not that great. I didn't say anything wrong in it, but it's not very tight. It's not a good examination of the idea. So I'm going to redo it. Let's discuss that well-known phrase, everything is political. A precursor to everything is political is the similar phrase, the personal is political. This is a second-wave feminist slogan, popularized in Carol Hanich's 1969 essay of the same name, but it was in use before that. The idea is that women's private issues like childcare or sex, or being stuck as a housewife, these weren't simply personal issues, they were political issues. They couldn't be solved by personal change on the individual level. They had to be solved politically, systemically. This idea isn't entirely without merit. Sometimes you might have a problem in your personal life where its origin is something outside of your immediate sphere of control, something systemic that can't be solved simply with your own personal efforts. But the personal is political is a blanket statement. It's not saying that some personal things can have a political component. It's saying the personal is political, the personal referring to the set of all personal things. For a liberal, and for some conservatives, there is the idea of the public-private split. The public sphere is one in which the whole of society has access, has an interest in what's going on. Anybody can use a public road or a public park. A public utility has a duty to guarantee some level of equality of access to all people who want to use it. A public debate is one in which anyone can speak freely, like a speaker's corner. And the government, being a public entity, that means that everyone should be treated the same by it, and have the same ability to engage with it, hence the liberal values of universal suffrage and equality before the law. To contrast, the private sphere is one in which the whole of society does not have access, but only specific people have a right to it. My privately owned house is not like a public road or a park. Not everyone can use it, only the individuals that I allow. A privately owned business is not like a public utility. The owner of a business should have the right to refuse service based on his preferences. A private platform is not like a speaker's corner. The owners of the platform have their own free speech rights, and forcing them to host speech they disagree with violates those rights. The difference between these two spheres, philosophically, is that the public sphere is inclusive, universal, and equal, while the private sphere is exclusive, particular, and hierarchical. Both of these spheres are required for society to function properly. There has to be a public sphere where everyone is held to the same standard, regardless of their personal differences. And there also has to be a private sphere where individuals can determine the particulars of their lives, even if they're different and therefore not equal with others. A great example of this public-private split was when the Canadian Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, famously said, "The government has no place in the bedrooms of the nation," when legislation to decriminalize sodomy was on the table in 1968. What's being said here, philosophically, is that the government is the domain of the public, where the whole of society has a say, while the bedroom is in the domain of the private, where only the individuals within that space have a say, and the rest of society can, bugger off. The best way to conceptualize it is like this. The private is the domain of the personal, the public is the domain of the political. However, not all political philosophies agree with the public-private split. Socialists and fascists are probably the most famous rejectors of the idea. To them, the idea of a private domain, a personal domain, where the wider society holds no sway, that goes against their ideology. For the fascist, the phrase everything within the state is the equivalent of everything is political. The state is the political entity, and the fascist views the state as having a monopoly over all human activity, including things that a liberal would say is private. There is no personal space in which the rest of society has no say for the fascist. For the socialist, it's basically the same thing, but they're less honest about it. For example, you may have heard a socialist say that private property and personal property aren't the same thing. "We're not coming for your toothbrush." What the socialist means by this is that personal property is stuff that you own and use yourself, while private property is stuff that you own but you don't use it. You pay other people to use it, and you extract profit from them. The socialist claims to want to abolish only private property, not personal property, hence the straw man example of "we're not coming for your toothbrush." It still doesn't work though. Soviet collectivization of agriculture affected only private property, and it still destroyed their economy and caused a famine. The various socialist states that implemented communal kitchens, or forced people into those large gray apartment blocks, these are all examples of the socialist difference between private property and personal property breaking down. Even if a hypothetical utopian socialist society did it perfectly, they would still need to have a massive surveillance state in order to ensure that you're not running a private business out of the back of your personally owned house, for example. There's a lot of problems with this idea, and this video isn't about those problems, so I don't want to get too deep into it. But basically, in implementation, if not in theory, the socialist view of the liberal public-private split is the same as the fascist one. For the liberal, remember, the private is the domain of the personal, and the public is the domain of the political. So, when the second-wave feminist says the personal is political, philosophically they're saying the private is public. It's denying that liberal idea that there are some parts of the human experience that are appropriately private, and some that are appropriately public, which is probably why so many things that were once considered private, like for example people's sex lives, have become increasingly public. And you're considered a prude if you like to keep your sex life private, or you don't want to hear about the sex lives of others. Again, I still want to give the devil his due. Even if liberal society's idea of a public-private split is a good one, there are going to be many instances where one sphere bleeds into the other. It might be a private affair that you can't afford to buy a house. Maybe you're lazy or you're stupid, or you went into a bad career and you don't have any money. But it also might be a public affair. Maybe there's some terrible government policy that's making it harder for you to buy a house than it should be, all other things being equal. It could be either of those things, and it's reasonable for people to complain that it's out of their hands when it ends up being a policy problem and not a personal failing. But all the same, how many times have you seen some hyper-progressive out there make the claim that everything is systemic? If someone can't afford a house and you blame it on a personal failing of theirs, you're being a bigot because it can't actually be their fault. We're all blank slates. And expecting people to get ahead on their own merit is toxic individualism or bootstrap mentality or late-stage capitalism. Meritocracy can never actually exist. Blah, 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 blah. If a problem exists in the domain of the personal, the private, then you can do something about it. If a problem exists in the domain of the public, the political, then you probably can't do anything about it yourself, and you need systemic change. The idea that the personal is political is an idea that disenfranchises the individual. It says that he cannot take any action to solve any problem on a personal level because it's all within the political sphere, and expecting him to take the reins of his own life is toxic. This is, of course, fucking retarded, but hopefully this shines some light onto why so many parts of the progressive movement tend to devalue individual action and insist that a huge nanny state is needed to fix everything or something. The phrase "everything is political" is a natural descendant of the "personal is political." Everything is political began in the media analysis and criticism part of the internet, at least as far as I can tell. Back during Gamergate, and even earlier, you had people like Anita Sarkeesian here who would say her very famous line.
Everything is sexist, everything is racist, everything is homophobic.
What she's saying here is that everything is political, because racism and sexism are not simply personal slights. They are systems, and they can only be challenged and abolished systemically. And so the personal is political. Everything is political. And let me tell you, we hated this shit back in the day. However, we were ignorant. Let me show you how. In the context of the phrase "everything is political," everything means, well, everything. Both things that liberals would consider to be public and private. Everything here represents the synthesis of the private and public spheres. Political means the complex network of relationships and systems that people engage with, for the purposes of coalition building, obtaining power over these systems, and then directing them towards an end. Another phrase we all hated back in the day is power politics, but the hard-to-swallow truth is, all politics is power politics, whether it's forming a real government, running an HOA or a club, office politics, or hell, even the informal pecking order in a group of friends, where one guy disproportionately decides where you're all going to eat every time you go out, and the rest of the group is happy to let him do it. It's all politics, and it all ends with somebody being the one who makes decisions that others follow and implement. To be political means to pursue power over other people, and that sounds malicious, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, in most cases it's not. And us centrist liberal normie types back during the Gamergate era, we had a hard time swallowing that truth. But it is true. Here's a meme you might have seen floating around a lot. It's got the quartering smiling at something he enjoys. In this example, it's old Star Wars, but I've seen this for various video games, comic books, TV shows, whatever. And then when it's new Star Wars, the black character, the quartering is frowning and saying, "You made it political." The joke behind the meme is that the quartering recognizes the political content in the second image. It's including a black person as a main hero in a franchise that was, up until that point, disproportionately white. And racial representation is a political statement about race relations in real life outside of Star Wars. Yes, I know, Lando Calrissian. I'm explaining their retarded idea. I'm not saying I agree with it. In this meme, the quartering doesn't recognize the political nature of the original Star Wars, presumably because he grew up with it. The Empire doesn't have political content to him, because when he was a kid, they were simply the bad guys. And that way of viewing Star Wars hasn't been updated in his head since those days. In actuality, there's a lot of political content in Star Wars, the nature of empire and political rebellions being the most obvious. I did a whole video on that, in fact. By the way, I don't think the actual quartering would think like this. This is clearly a lefty meme meant to shit on him. However, the underlying substance of this meme is making fun of the liberal idea of the public-private split, at least insofar as media analysis is concerned. If, for the liberal, there is the public political domain, where things can be debated and equal access secured and all of that, and then there's also the private personal domain, where individuals have a space to pursue their own subjective preferences without interference, then insofar as media analysis is concerned, progressives tend to view liberals as naive sheep who must be led to the correct conclusion. If all art is political, then there can be no private consumption of art. The person who enjoys art without engaging with its political components is actively blinding themselves to those components for their hedonistic purposes. And you know what? Liberals and conservatives have clued into this game, which is why you sometimes see this meme floating around too. The idea that politics-addicted snobs cannot understand simply enjoying something is quite valid too. But this is where we get that tired nonsense of, I can't believe that conservatives watch Star Trek or The Boys or Starship Troopers or whatever and don't understand it's making fun of them. How could you be so media illiterate? Well, one, it is completely valid to simply enjoy a work for the fun of it, for the ride, and not think about it too much. We're not machines. Our brains don't need to be 100% on and engaged all the time, and getting some downtime where you just chill and enjoy something is pretty good too. 2. Not all art has left-wing political themes, and progressives trying to claim as many properties as leftist, using often very flimsy reasoning, is both fucking annoying and a problem for the culture war. A problem that I hope to tackle eventually with a future video series. But most importantly, the problem that we had back during Gamergate, the problem that is accurately being identified with that quartering meme, is that there is truth to the idea that all art is political, that everything is political. It's more accurate to say that everything has a political interpretation, or an impact on real politics, even if that impact is near infinitely small. But our insistence that we don't have the conversation in these terms is the reason why progressives won so many culture wars over the past decade. Here's a hypothetical example. Let's go back to Anita Sarkeesian again. Something that she would say is like, Mario Brothers is political because it reinforces the heteronormative patriarchy of male heroes rescuing female victims, and then being rewarded with sexual access to them. Because Princess Peach gets kidnapped, Mario saves her from Bowser, and then Peach kisses Mario on the nose. The logic is basically something like that. Back during Gamergate, my response to that would have been, it ain't that deep, bro. You're being ridiculous, it's just a game. What was underneath my response was, I enjoy Mario games because they're fun. I don't want to engage with the political content of Mario Brothers games because that will suck the fun out of them. Let me have my escapism. And you know what? That's completely fair. Lots of people feel this way. However, this hypothetical Anita Sarkeesian would counter past Dev by saying, well, you don't think Mario's political, but I do. Mario should represent my politics. It shouldn't matter to you as long as the game's fun, right? And so this space in the conversation ends up ceded to the hypothetical Anita because past Dev wasn't willing to engage with what she was correct about. If, in this hypothetical situation, Mario Brothers began to subvert expectations and smashing the patriarchy, but was still a really fun game, that would be annoying, but ultimately probably tolerable. The issue is, the games that progressives make aren't only politically subversive, they're also really fucking bad. But again, that's a video for the future. If you watched my Antonio Gramsci video, you would understand the hypothetical Anita Sarkeesian is right. Mario does, in his own very small way, reinforce the heteronormative patriarchy of male heroes rescuing female victims, and then being rewarded with sexual access to them. And the proper response to say to Anita is, yes, that's good. We want there to be heroic male role models who are willing to go battle dragons and demons and save the princess, because that is a good thing for young boys to aspire to. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise, you are making their destiny not brighter, but darker. Subverting expectations can be fun, but first there has to be a solid cultural foundation in place. A canon of expectations must first exist before you can play around with subverting them. I've heard many progressives say over the years that your private consumption habits, not just with media but with everything, they're not simply a personal affair, they're political. And fair enough. When you, for example, buy a coffee, who knows how many people were exploited during its creation? There's no ethical consumption under capitalism after all. All employment is theft. I get the idea. If you simply close your eyes to this critique, if you deny that everything can have a political interpretation, you will once again cede that ground. This is why progressives have run successful boycotts of various actors or artists or creators or whatever who publicly disagree with their politics, because they viewed their consumption habits as having a political dimension, and therefore they had a moral obligation to, for example, not play Five Nights at Freddy's or Hogwarts Legacy, or demand Gina Carano get deplatformed and blacklisted. There's tons of examples here, I'm sure you don't need me to lay them all out. You know what I'm talking about. This is also why, once the online right finally began to gain a political consciousness in the culture war, progressives began to scream that the internet was descending into an era of alt-right fascism or whatever. Whether you agree with their politics or not, when right-wingers began to organize their own product boycotts, like Bud Light for example, based on that raised political consciousness, they were finally doing so with the understanding that their consumption has a moral component, because everything's political. Hogwarts Legacy represents a politics that leftists find immoral, so they boycott because everything's political. Bud Light represents a politics that rightists find immoral, so they boycott because everything's political. Personally, I reject both these boycotts, for two reasons. One, I'm not a part of the left or the right. I feel no loyalty to either. I'm not morally obligated to support either their political projects. Two, as a pragmatic person, I recognize that everything does have a political component, sure. But also as a liberal, I recognize the individual has a right to ignore that political component and do whatever the fuck they want. I'm not stupid enough nowadays to say, not everything is political, guys, and I am happy to rigorously enforce my own politics and standards within my own spaces when necessary. But if I want to sit down on my off time, ignore the political ramifications of my choices, and enjoy a tall glass of Bud Light while playing Hogwarts Legacy, I have the right to do that. And I also have the right to tell political busybodies to get their noses out of my private spaces. That is why the liberal public-private split is a necessary invention of our society. It's the creation of this small space, a personal retreat from the trials of the world for every single person, where they can say, okay, even if everything is political, this is a place where I can do what I want. In this place, I have the freedom to engage with aspects of life in a way that might run counter to my ideals, but that's okay because it's my downtime. Ideologues don't like this. They want you to be fully devoted to the cause, but fuck them. A personal example is I don't like Nestea. I think they're an awful company doing awful things. But you know what? I love those drumstick ice cream cones. I don't eat them often because I don't like supporting Nestle, and that is a political decision. But I still treat myself every once in a while, and I don't feel the need to rake myself over the coals for it. And I certainly would not accept any outside judgment from anti-Nestle activists either, because fuck you, I'll do whatever I want. Anyway, everything is political, meaning everything has a political interpretation or impact. Rejecting this truth simply means sticking your head in the sand. But just because everything is political doesn't mean that you're morally obligated to adopt the politics of people who hate you or want to destroy your spaces. Just because everything has a political interpretation doesn't mean that you must engage with only that interpretation all the time. Just because everything has a political impact doesn't mean you always have to give a shit. Sometimes you just want the Nestle ice cream cone, and that's okay too. So the next time you hear the phrase, everything is political, don't shy away from it, because that's how you lose. Say, yes, it is, which is why my spaces and my life should reflect my political values and not yours.